There's a sign prominently displayed in a tavern that says, "No Wi-Fi, talk to each other and get drunk." It's an old-fashioned idea and one that we would do well to remember when we are meeting friends for dinner or going out to hear music. We are now so attached to our technology that it's not uncommon to see a group of friends sitting at a table in public, not interacting with each other at all, but instead sitting in close proximity to one another, but texting, Snapchatting, or Facebooking with friends scattered all over the globe. A few years ago, a California news station had a helicopter following a 600-pound black bear that was wandering through a neighborhood, and they captured a video of a man who literally walked right into the bear because he was staring at his phone and texting. Now, I wouldn't wish that kind of encounter on anyone, but folks, sometimes the real world has to break in to your imaginary cyber world. We have, in fact, become so disconnected from reality and so locked into interfacing with our technology that there is now a sub-discipline of the field of anthropology called Cyborg Anthropology. Not that we're becoming RoboCop or Terminator, but we are cyborgs whenever we make a digital or mechanical device a part of ourselves and how we relate to the world around us. When I go scuba diving, I put on a mask so that I can see clearly underwater like a fish does. I put on fins so that I can glide through the water like a fish. I wear a regulator and an air tank so that I can breathe as if I had gills. And I wear a BC vest that has both an air bladder and weights incorporated in it so that I can balance my neutral spot in the water, just like a fish. So for an hour at a time, I'm a cyborg fish, living in a universe that is entirely different from the world that exists above the ocean surface. Through our technology, many of us do something very similar. We check out of reality, and we enter a universe that's partially real and partially imaginary. Many of us stay so locked into our televisions, our computers, our smartphones, and digitally integrated cars and houses now that we literally spend more time staring into a screen than we spend doing anything else, including sleeping. That years ago, it was difficult to get a child to watch television. But now the very nature of our species is evolving, and children as young as 2 are spending upwards of 4 hours a day looking into a screen. Now, I was an early adopter of most of these technological innovations. I gladly made the switch from an electric typewriter to one of the first PCs available because I was in grad school and having to type a lot of papers, and just being able to correct on the screen rather than retyping and retyping and retyping, that was a huge gift. But while my first computer was little more than a smart typewriter, once you abandon the mechanical for the digital, it's kind of like falling into that rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. You don't have any idea what's coming, but there's an entirely different universe that you are falling headlong into. Very quickly, my paper calendar, my day runner, became a Palm Pilot. My landline was supplemented by a pager and a car phone, then a cell phone, then a smartphone that eventually completely replaced both paper and digital calendars, the home phone, the camera, my GPS, and to a large degree, the need to remember anything as basic as my daughter's birthday or my best friend's telephone numbers. The sociological changes that came with these technological advances were never anticipated. We didn't talk about them in advance. We didn't predict them, and we didn't give it much thought. We just started incorporating it into our lives, and it changed us in unconscious ways without ever thinking about, what are we giving up here? What are we losing here? How we communicate with one another and the larger world has totally transformed in just the last decade. In just the brief history of this church, who we were when we started this church in 2008 and who we are now is really, really different. When I was in grad school, I studied pastoral counseling as my major. We spent a lot of time learning how to help families that were in conflict to work out their problems, to save their marriages, or to deal with their adolescent malcontents that they shared space with. We realized that couples would speak much more kindly to one another if they were sitting side by side than they would if they were sitting with a table in between them. And so in really conflicted marriages, we would have couples sit with their toes and their knees touching and holding hands and looking directly into each other's faces. And I can't tell you how horribly uncomfortable that was for a couple that was in conflict. But you tend to really reel in your speech when you're in direct contact with someone, that you, even if someone has a table in between, or if one is standing up and the other is sitting down, these whole dominant postures that allow speech to become really exaggerated, and the language becomes more harsh the more distance and space or things in between the two people. If they have a serious conversation on the telephone, it is infinitely more likely to become very heated and less rational. But our new technology of email, texting, and social media adds layer upon layer to the insulation so that we have to almost curse and scream on social media to get attention. It's almost, there's very little difference between what you will say on Facebook and what you will say to the bad driver in front of you who can't hear you at all. Most people can tell you about losing friends as soon as they opened a social media account, because you find yourself being just sucked into these vitriolic exchanges that if you were having them sitting in someone's living room, which I try to tell people, don't say something to me in social media that you wouldn't say if you were sitting in the living room in my home. Because about half of what gets said in social media would be diagnostic criteria for insanity if you were saying it physically to a person sitting in their house. Technology has turned us into a culture of watchers when we used to be readers. It has given us all a kind of ADD. A decade ago, we used to start the coffee, go out in the driveway, get the newspaper, and you bring it in and you spend 30 minutes to an hour leafing through the paper, thinking about what's going on in the world. Now everyone tells themselves that they get their news online. But for the most part, if the news is more complicated than a Facebook meme or a 140-character tweet on Twitter, then we quickly lose interest. I post my sermons every Sunday online, and I give a paragraph description of the sermon, and I find about half of the comments that I get online are people responding to the description. They've never watched the sermon. And people will link articles, and people will read the headline of the article and then immediately tell you what they think about the article without having ever read it. We have become a culture with such a short attention span that we just react. We don't think, we just react. People who get all of their news by looking at the feed on their web browser or in scanning their Facebook crawl will confidently tell themselves that they are informed enough to tell their family members and people who used to be their friends that they are stupid if they don't agree with you, that I saw this Facebook meme and now I know, and you're stupid if you don't like it like I do. We didn't see these changes coming. This is not who we chose to be, but we have increasingly become an uninformed population that is incredibly vulnerable to fake news and manipulative propaganda. Fox News readers, the people on Fox News, speak in such condescending tones that they empower those C and D and F students from school with the false confidence to make them believe that the A and B students that they were always felt inferior to in school, that they are now superior to them. That it's ignorant liberals or the elite. If you've got a college degree or 2 or 3 or 4, it's not that you learned anything, it's that you've become an elite and now to be talked down to. And that's almost a presumption in Fox News, even though those people sitting on the sofas and reading beautiful blondes in short skirts have law degrees and were Fulbright scholars, and they know better, but they are playing their public as if they were sock puppets. Amen. And then to seek confirmation of their single-sentence grasp of current events, they use the most pejorative language they can to demand that everyone now agree with them. We don't look deeply into the financial conflicts of the Trump cabinet appointments. We just start calling them all Nazis. Now, folks, I make my living in a profession that is rife with exaggeration and apocryphal storytelling. But seriously, unless someone has set about killing 6 million people in a modern Holocaust, they are not a Nazi. Let's save some of our vitriol because we might need it later. There's something called the Godwin Rule that an attorney came up with that said any internet conversation that goes on for an amount of time, every second they're getting closer to calling someone Hitler. That anything, the exaggeration just immediately ratchets up to that. And I just think we've got to rein that in. When my daughter was little, I just didn't allow her to use the word hate for things like homework or broccoli or bedtime. I'd tell her, honey, we don't really hate anything except Republican congressmen. But I found out that she was correcting her friends at school. Same way, we really only hate Republican congressmen. So then I had to tell a little white lie, and I said, honey, we really don't even hate Republican congressmen. We don't. The election of Donald Trump to the office of the presidency has thrown this whole cyber universe into overdrive. Our nation has been suffering from serious partisan divide for a long time now, probably 2 decades in particular, but generationally. It has progressively gotten worse, and now social media and our cyber connections has poured gasoline onto the tendency was already there to divide ourselves between you're with me and everybody else is other and somehow inferior and worthy of being dismissed. Our society is out of balance. We hurl the most absurdly exaggerated insults at those who are on the other side of the fence, and we are seemingly incapable of being self-critical. When we started this church a few years ago, I naively hoped that a church specifically created to be a liberal, intellectual, and social justice-oriented community would be free of the kind of ego-driven political battles that I'd suffered through for 30 years as a disciple pastor. That wishful thinking was exploded over and over in our first 2 years of life when people were coming and going from our community so fast that the ink never dried in our membership book. One large multifamily group left our church in our first months after I published a column in the Springfield News Leader condemning the torture of war prisoners. And I asked the patriarch of this family group, so you're going to go to a pro-torture church? And he said, well, I'll go to a church where the preacher's smart enough not to mention it. Hardly a month later, I criticized President Obama for appointing a Monsanto executive, Michael Taylor, to be in charge of the Food and Drug Administration. Several members left at that time that were active members of the Greene County Democratic Party because I had dared to criticize our newly elected Democratic president. They didn't like the fact that Obama had appointed a fox to guard the hen house, but they didn't think that I should be allowed to be critical of him, as if it should be a mystery to anyone that I'm an equal opportunity offender. No one is safe. Soren Kierkegaard said that we tend to be objective about others and subjective in our judgments of ourselves. That is, we put everyone else under the microscope and we dissect them, but we refuse to see any of our own flaws. And he said it really ought to be the other way around. We ought to be particularly self-critical, objective about ourselves, but be willing to be generously subjective in assessing other people. We are liberals, but that cannot mean that we are uncritical of our own tribe while we slander everybody else. We began today with this wisdom lesson taken from a speech by Teddy Roosevelt. The media had taken a rough turn during Roosevelt's time. This is not the first time that partisan divides were rough, and Teddy Roosevelt was really being beaten up by mudslinging in the media, some of which would put Facebook trolls to shame. But Roosevelt tried to speak a word of balance, saying that we need to be honest and objective about our president. Not that anyone gets put up on a pedestal where they cannot be criticized, but no one should be lied about in order to tear down their character or their reputation or their influence. You don't praise someone because they happen to be a member of your party and reject someone because they're a member of the other party, but there really needs to be some open, honest conversation between both sides. To fail to be critical of a president when he or she is in the wrong, Roosevelt says, is a failure to be patriotic. I remember when George W. Bush was starting the bombing of Afghanistan, and I was critical of that in public, and a lovely elderly lady in the church I served at the time called and said, "Well, now, Roger, do you really believe that you know more about this than our president?" Yes. Yes, I do. And in her world, it was just inconceivable that a corpulent cleric in the Midwest would have the audacity to criticize a president. And I understand that there were certain people that you were supposed to look up to and never criticize, but there has to be a willingness to be honest. We're not always going to be right about it, but we need to be able to be critical. I am certain that there is not a person in this room who voted for Donald Trump. And I am reasonably sure that of our 15,000 internet viewers, that there's not 1 in 1,000 who voted for Donald Trump. But, folks, Trump is not Hitler. He's not Stalin. He isn't even Putin, even though he lacks the critical thinking skills to realize how Putin is playing him. We then were on the losing side of this election. And we will have a lot to do over the next year or two, however long he stays in office. I suppose if he's lucky, 4 years. We've got to be able to reasonably, rationally, accurately, and forcefully confront the xenophobia, the homophobia, the Islamophobia, and the misogyny of his enthusiastic base. We've lost an election, but we don't need to lose history. Amen. We've lost an election, but we must not lose our way. We lost at the ballot box, but let's not lose who we are in the process. We cannot meaningfully now, in this culture, insulate ourselves from the hysteria of the 24-hour news commentators. It's in the air. You could set your TV on fire, and it's still going to get to you just because you are in the culture. We are not likely to be able to avoid the content of social media, of email, or political slander, but we can choose to be better than all of it. I've been shocked. I've been angry. I've been itching for a fight. I mean, there's a part of me that really looks for a confrontation. But I'm begging you, don't burn bridges unnecessarily. Speak to each other in ways that intend to be heard and understood rather than just to make a point. Don't just cut up your opponents and leave them bleeding on the floor. Try to persuade, to educate, to inspire, but don't eviscerate and alienate and reject people. Now, I'm not going to be giving our president a pass on any violation of public ethics. But I encourage you not to give me a pass if you ever hear me exaggerating the facts or going beyond reason or if I pass along any false information, because I don't want to be the kind of guy that does that. I want to be able to courageously state the truth in public, but not go past that. The way to fight against fake news is to be painstakingly honest. The way to avoid being a fawning fan of anyone is to be thorough enough to read between the lines and to look for the more complicated truth that always lies beneath the surface of the too simple assumptions of mere gossip. Let us be committed to the truth, but if we must err at any point, let us err on the side of being generous. Let's err on the side of being too loving, too forgiving, and too accepting. Trust me, if you have a friend in the world, it is because that person decided to be generously accepting and forgiving of you. And you owe at least that much to them. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.